the system works. And so if we change the institutions effectively, we change the incentive system, and hopefully we change it in directions that makes it more effective. Now I have one more background piece before I get to telling the main part of my story, and that is violence. Humans are like chimpanzees. Not completely, you understand. But one of the things that distinguishes chimpanzees from other primates is that they're violent with each other. They kill each other. Now, a lot of primates like bonobos and so on are much more tolerant and gentle with each other. Human beings are violent. And one of the things you've got to understand if you're going to understand how societies work is that the kind of ways that human beings have structured themselves to try to make the society work means you've got to limit violence amongst the participants. You've got to constrain the players so in their own interests they will cooperate and do things that will make the system work. Now with this background, I want to argue that there's just three social orders in all of human history. And by social order, I mean three ways that human beings have structured the game to try to get the society to produce economic, political, and social activity. The first is a primitive social order, and I'm not going to talk about that. That's hunting and gathering societies, and it's of historical interest. And in the book that I'm writing with my colleagues, we do devote some attention to it. But the next two social orders are ones that are of real relevance to the world we live in today. The second is what John called the natural state, or limited access societies. And limited access societies began with the development of agriculture in 8000 BC in Mesopotamia, and still characterize more than 3/4 of the world's population today. What's made the natural state so natural is that when you put people together, and in the face of the continual threat of violence, they tend to form a structure that is remarkably similar in its basic framework all over again. That is, what you will get was a group of elites in political, economic, social organizations that will run it. They'll be a small percentage of the population, maybe 10, 15, 20% at the most. Those elites will find it in their interest to cooperate with each other in order to prevent violence from occurring, and they'll cooperate in ways that ensures that they jointly support each other's rents, that is, income that derive from various kinds of activity. To give you an illustration, economic elites will support political elites in return for the political elite limiting the competition that economic elite faces. In other words, giving them monopoly returns. And if you think that's unusual, I can assure you, if you look around the world at natural states, that's standard. It exists everywhere. But it's not just economic elites. The same holds true for religious, social, political. All elites stand to gain by cooperating with each other and protecting each other's rents in an interdependent structure. In return for that, they get some stability, a modest amount of economic growth, and indeed preserve a way that maintains their privileges. Notice that in the world I'm describing, it has several crucial features, one of which is that only about maybe 15 to 20% of the population are parts of the elites and enjoy all the privileges. The rest of the population are, well, at best, second-class citizens. That is, whether they're serfs or slaves or simply not part of the elites, they don't enjoy the same privileges, the same rights that the elites do. The second feature about the natural state that's important is that it is a world of personal exchange. It's a world in which the way to deal with other people is who you know. Now, I want to emphasize this because personal exchange is a key feature of limited access societies. It's a key feature of the way in which humans deal with each other. When I'm advisor to countries that are natural states, and I'm advisor to quite a number of them, I always ask, I don't find out what the rules of the game are. I find out who really determines what the rules are. And that's the person you want to go and talk to and see, because that determines really what happens in the system. Now, I'm going to come back to the limited access or natural state, but I want to talk about the third social order. The first was a primitive one, the second, limited access. The third is an open access society. It probably occupies no more than 15 to 20% of the world's population today. And it has emerged in the last 300 years at most. Its key feature is competition in both political and economic markets. And indeed, competition that makes it so that the rents that I observed in a limited access society tends to be temporary and eliminated over time, because if you have rents that are making for very high rates of return, whether political, economic, or social, it'll be in the interest, in a world of competition, for groups to come in and attempt to do things better in that particular market and replace the existing group. So an open access society is a very dynamic society. Also, it has the feature that it doesn't matter who you are. What matters is that the rules of the game apply to everyone. That is, what you have, instead of personal exchange, you have impersonal exchange. You have property rights that are defined, that apply not just to elites, but apply to everybody in the society. And the property rights, therefore, tend to define the way the game is played, and judicial systems play the role of seeing that the rules are enforced between groups in participation and in exchange. So an open access society is just a very different sort of a world. And indeed, the differences are much more than appear on the face, because if you're going to have an open access society, first of all, it requires that most of the people in the society become participants, that is, become equal citizens in the system. And indeed, when you look at the development of open access society, you see that they gradually move from limited property rights over who could vote, to extending property rights to wider groups, to opening, to bringing in minorities, to bringing in women, and so on. This process of expansion, so that the open access society is innately a democratic system, in the sense that everybody participates, everybody is equal, and that characterizes the system. Now, at this point, I hope you're saying, well, if it's so desirable, how come all the world isn't open access? And it is desirable in the sense of per capita income. If you look at per capita income of countries around the world, you observe that limited access societies have per capita incomes that typically are below $10,000 per capita. A lot of them way below. Whereas open access societies are those that typically have per capita income between $20,000 and $40,000 per person. An immense gap. It's not just a small gap. And that's because an open access society typically produces such dynamic change that productivity keeps on growing continually. And as a matter of fact, when we do studies, but what we observe is that open access societies don't necessarily grow more rapidly on a particular year than limited access societies, which do grow, but they grow steadily. Whereas limited access societies tend to have periods of rapid growth when they, say, get some commodity that's in big world demand, and then fall back into recession and depression and chaos at times in this case. How do we get from one to the other? What we call a transition in our book. But the transition is one that requires that we transform society. And this is why it turns out to be so complicated, because if you're going to transform a world from one in which there's privilege, unequal opportunity, unequal access to privilege and so on, to one in which everybody, at least on the surface, is nominally equal, and in which everybody has a voice, you're fundamentally making a change that is so fundamental that it changes the way the game is played. There's 3 doorstep conditions that have characterized the transition. The first doorstep condition is that elite groups, in their own self-interest, and that last phrase is very important, in their own self-interest, will extend property rights to a wider and wider group of the population in the interest of increasing the amount of rents that they get, which is not surprising. You have, they can expand economic activity, and if they include more people in it, they get more rents. But once you've done that, what you begin to do, and is do the second doorstep condition, which in order to do that, you've got to take and create institutions and organizations that are out of the reach of government. So far, in a limited access society, all of the institutions that are created are creatures of government and don't exist without the support of government. But if you're going to get many of the advantages of wider markets, you need to create organizations that can take advantage of new opportunities. If you want to look at the historical part of the story, when you see the Netherlands, England, and France in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, what they did is observe the opportunities that arose from overseas trade. And to begin with, what the governments did was create monopolies that, like the East India Company or other companies like this, that went about extending overseas trade. But over time, these companies found it to their advantage to be able to have degrees of autonomy that were independent of government control. And eventually what you got was the governments granting them the right to establish themselves independent of this. So what you gradually evolved was institutions and organizations that gradually proliferated to take advantage of the enormous growth and opportunities associated with increasing trade and commerce and so on. So that's step 2. Step 3 is a more complicated one, and I won't deal with it adequately. And that is, in a limited access society, the key to preventing violence is that you have elite groups, that one of which is the military itself. And the elite groups cooperate with the military so that they join